say some lives begin with lightning, with ruptures, with storms that announce themselves. Mine began in the hush of a Sunday morning, when the world outside our suburban window was washed in gold and stillness. The smell of cinnamon toast drifting from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of my mother's rose tea. And in that moment, I believed in permanence, that some things, once built with love, would never shift. My name is Lexi. I'm 17, a senior preparing to leave behind this town that raised me with tidy lawns and silent fences. My days were scheduled, my grades immaculate, my ambitions sharp. Every evening, my father, Mr. Davis, would peek into my room with a gentle knock and ask how the SAT prep was going, while my mother, Mrs. Davis, always left little notes tucked into my lunchbox, lines of encouragement written in looping cursive, ending with, "Always believe, sweetheart." I carried their hopes like silk stitched into my spine, and I was their daughter, not by blood, but by every act of love they'd poured into me. There were pictures in the hallway, birthdays, piano recitals, science fair ribbons, my smile unchanged, my eyes searching the lens for something I never questioned. Until, one day, I caught my reflection beside my mother's. She had chestnut curls. I had deep raven waves. Her eyes crinkled with laughter. Mine held something distant. That moment passed quickly, like a breeze brushing past a closed window, but it left behind a tremor, a whisper, an unnamed feeling that lingered in the quiet. That evening, I dreamt of a woman I couldn't place, her face in fragments, her voice submerged like it was reaching me through water. And though she didn't call me by name, she hummed an old lullaby, one I woke up knowing, though I had no memory of ever hearing it. I told no one, because some things felt too fragile to speak aloud. The melody followed me into morning, soft and incomplete. We were the perfect painting, Mr. Davis reading the newspaper by the fireplace, Mrs. Davis knitting something soft and useless just to keep her hands busy, and me, curled up with my college essays, annotating with precision. The clock ticked, the soup simmered, and the world didn't tremble. Yet deep inside me, a question had begun to breathe, slow, shallow, then louder. Who am I, beyond this curated calm? On Saturdays, we had routines. Pancakes at 9, music from the record player humming through the kitchen while sunlight filtered across the table. I remember once watching my parents dance slowly in their socks, laughing at something I couldn't hear. And in that moment, I felt the kind of belonging that doesn't demand proof. And yet, there were things I didn't share, like how I once overheard a woman at the grocery store say, "She looks nothing like them," and how that sentence lingered like smoke on clean fabric. I remember thinking that if life was a canvas, mine had been painted in soft pastels and deliberate strokes, but somewhere in the lower corner, invisible to others, a single drop of ink had begun to spread. A stain that wouldn't stay still. It didn't belong, yet it insisted on being seen. That morning, when I looked at my family and smiled, it wasn't fake, but it wasn't whole either. It was the kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows the music by heart but begins to hear a wrong note slipping in, almost imperceptible, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. I didn't know it then, but the painting was beginning to blur, not from carelessness, not from tragedy, but from something deeper, a past that had not vanished, only waited. And now, it was stepping into the light, uninvited, unrelenting, real. I didn't see them arrive, no moving truck, no introductions, no ripples in the calm of our street. They simply appeared. A woman with tired shoulders and a girl who wore defiance like a second skin. stepping out of a weathered car as if they had always belonged to the cracks between our well-trimmed hedges. And I remember the way the sunlight dulled when they passed our mailbox, as if the world, for a moment, exhaled something heavy. Something that didn't fit. Genevieve, that was her name, though I wouldn't hear it until later, had the kind of face that carried both softness and sharpness, a quiet hunger beneath her faded lipstick and loose cardigan, and the girl beside her, Bronwyn, looked at the world like it had broken a promise and never said sorry, with dark eyeliner, a chipped black nail on her thumb, and a gaze that landed on me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. Even our neighbors noticed, Mrs. Klein whispered something behind her hydrangeas, and the postman, who usually greeted everyone, only nodded as he passed them by, the first time we crossed paths. It was in the parking lot of the grocery store, where she dropped a bag of apples and I bent to help. Her hand brushed mine and lingered too long. "Lexi?" she asked, not quite surprised. And I nodded before I even knew why, because something in her voice curled inside me, strange and familiar. And I told myself it was coincidence, that some people simply carry an echo that tricks your chest into remembering. But even as I walked away, I could feel her watching, not with malice, but with a kind of expectation that scared me more. But the second time wasn't coincidence, nor the third. As Genevieve began showing up where I least expected, at the library, at the cafe I liked, on the same park bench where I studied on Tuesdays. And she didn't speak much at first, just watched me with a kind of reverence that made me uncomfortable, like I was a relic she thought she'd lost. And when she finally approached, her words didn't come as a question, they came as claim. Once, I overheard her say to Bronwyn, "She walks just like I did at 17. And even though it was a whisper, it thudded in my chest louder than thunder. "You look just like your father," she whispered one afternoon, handing me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. And I didn't drink it. My fingers tightened around the cup, around my breath, around the edges of a reality that no longer held. That same day, Bronwyn trailed behind her, arms crossed, face hard, but I noticed the way her eyes softened, just briefly, when Genevieve touched my shoulder, and it made the space between them feel even more foreign, at home. The air changed. My mother stood too long at the window, watching the sidewalk. And my father's smile faltered when he saw a certain name on the mail. They never said her name, but it hovered like smoke in the corners of the kitchen. Protective silence wrapping our home, not out of shame, but out of fear that if we said it aloud, it would become real. One night, I heard them whispering behind a closed door, not fighting, just a long murmur of concern, like they were rearranging the past into something less fragile. I tried to pretend it was nothing, that Genevieve and Bronwyn were just two more strangers in a world full of unfinished stories, but every time I saw them, the line between distance and closeness began to blur, and there was something in Bronwyn's eyes, not just resentment, but possession, as if she saw me not as a sister, but as a thief of a life she believed was hers. And in the silence that followed, I realized that some returns are not reunions. They are claims laid in shadow. One evening, Genevieve stood outside our gate. She didn't ring, just stood there, waiting, and when my father stepped out and asked her to leave, she didn't argue, she only said, "She has a right to know. I'm not here to ruin, I'm here to reclaim." And her voice didn't tremble, but mine did. They had arrived like a storm without thunder, and though nothing in our house had broken yet, I knew the windows were beginning to rattle. The foundation had shifted, and somewhere deep in my marrow, a voice I didn't recognize whispered, "They came for me." At first, I thought she was just curious, the kind of curiosity you offer a stranger who carries your name in secret. But it wasn't that. Because Bronwyn didn't want to know me. She wanted to dismantle me, piece by piece. As if my happiness was a house built on stolen ground and she had come to tear it down. Brick by invisible brick. And her envy wasn't loud, but it was present. A quiet pulse beneath every glance, every smirk, every pause that stretched too long. She lingered in school corridors where she didn't belong, stood by my locker without reason, laughed a little too hard when I passed by, and rumors began to surface like bruises under the skin. Whispers that I'd cheated, that I was a charity case, that my perfect grades were bought with favors, and though I didn't know where they started, I knew whose eyes followed them. Because Bronwyn didn't push, she let the cracks form on their own, like frost crawling across glass. Once, I caught her standing just outside the classroom door, watching as I presented a project, her expression unreadable. Lips barely parted like she wanted to interrupt but didn't. She turned away before I could catch her gaze. One afternoon, my term paper vanished, not misplaced, not forgotten, just gone. And though my teacher was kind, her doubt weighed heavier than accusation. And when I opened my locker 2 days later to find it slipped between torn candy wrappers and ink-stained receipts, I understood. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. That same week, someone swapped my locker combination, harmless on the surface, but enough to make me late to class, enough to make me feel watched. It was like living beside a shadow that refused to declare itself. I told no one, not because I was afraid, but because speaking it aloud felt like giving it power. And my parents would worry, my friends would pity. But I didn't want their softness. I wanted silence to harden me, to teach me how to stand still while someone tried to knock the ground loose beneath me. Because Bronwyn wasn't just hurt, she wanted me to be hollow. At home, tension folded into our routines. My mother clipped the same roses, but her fingers trembled more. My father reread the newspaper without turning the page, and across the street, the curtains in Genevieve's house moved with choreographed precision, as if someone behind them was always watching, and the air between our homes thickened with something unnamed. Not hatred, not sorrow, but the density of two truths trying to occupy the same space. And then came the lunchroom moment. The day my essay was read aloud by a substitute teacher who mistook Bronwyn's copy for mine. And it wasn't mine. It was a twisted version. The words were wrong, the conclusion cruel. And I sat there, frozen, while the room rustled with awkwardness and disbelief. And Bronwyn looked at me across the table, her mouth set in a line that knew what it had done. And she didn't need to say anything, because her victory was silent and sharp. Later that day, someone had scratched the word imposter onto my desk, shallow enough to be overlooked, deep enough to stay. That night, my mother asked if I was all right, and I nodded. I smiled. I retreated, not because I didn't want her comfort, but because I didn't know how to explain a pain that didn't bruise, a war that didn't use weapons, a sister who didn't want a reunion. She wanted erasure. I began journaling, not for clarity, but as a way to anchor myself. One page, one sentence, one breath at a time. Somewhere in that haze, I realized Bronwyn didn't want me back in the family. She wanted me undone, and she didn't want a sister. She wanted the version of life she believed I had stolen, and in her gaze, I saw it clearly. Not grief, not longing, but possession. The kind that claws and clings and refuses to let go. She didn't want me to come home. She wanted me to fall, and she would keep trying. Until I did. There was a quiet rebellion forming beneath my ribs, not loud, not reckless, but persistent, like the slow tilt of the sun before a storm. And I kept returning to Genevieve's face in my mind, the softness in her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she said my name like it had always belonged on her tongue, and I hated that it stirred something, a warmth I didn't want to feel, a recognition I didn't ask for. And yet, it was there, a flicker in the dark, a pulse that whispered, "Not everything you've been told is whole." The more Bronwyn circled me, the more I found myself circling the silence between the adults. My mother's hands grew more still at dinner. My father's voice softened when certain topics arose, and the name Genevieve was never spoken. But her presence became a ghost that lived among our plates, our bookshelves, the folds of my bedding. It didn't haunt with malice. It pressed with memory, unclaimed memory that somehow already knew my name. One afternoon, Genevieve handed me a small object, a keychain shaped like a silver moon, its edges worn, the initials LM engraved in tiny, faded font, and she said, "You used to sleep with this in your fist," almost offhandedly, and before I could question how she knew, I felt the weight of it sink into my palm, not because it proved anything, but because it felt known, not familiar, deeper than that, like it had waited. That night, I dreamt I was 5 again, holding something small and cold while a lullaby played in the background, not sung, but hummed, the tune matching the vibration I felt in my chest when Genevieve said my name. That night, I watched my parents more closely than ever. Every gesture felt rehearsed, every smile a little too careful, and I didn't blame them. They loved me with everything they had. But I saw something they tried to protect me from. Fear. Not fear of Genevieve, but of what I might do if I looked too long into the parts of myself they hadn't written. And that kind of fear has a shadow that stretches farther than words can reach. Once, I asked my mother if I ever had a blanket with stars on it. And she paused, just long enough for me to notice, before answering with something too quick, too neat. And that was when I knew. There were fractures in the story I'd always believed. I didn't plan the DNA test like a rebellion. It wasn't vengeance or distrust. It was curiosity. Quiet, old, and aching. And I found a site online, one that promised heritage tracing and ancestral mapping. No names, no accusations, just sequences, data, silence. And I sent it off with hands that didn't shake but didn't feel steady either. I waited until the house was empty. I placed the kit on the counter. I hesitated. Then I opened it slowly, like it might whisper back. For days, I said nothing. But the act sat between my lungs like a secret growing roots. I still cooked dinner. I still laughed when my friends texted memes. But there was a space inside me that had been hollowed, not painfully, just intentionally, like something had been cleared out to make room for an answer I didn't know I needed. I thought I was looking for a story, a family tree, a map of migrations, a scientific timeline of bones and blood. But what I was opening was a question I didn't know how to finish. A quiet Pandora's box lined not with evil, but with truth too sharp to ignore. It didn't hiss. It waited. And somewhere deep in that stillness, I realized I wasn't betraying anyone. I was reclaiming the parts of me that had never been named aloud. Because even a heart built from love can ache to know where its first beat began. It arrived on a Thursday, an ordinary envelope, cream-colored and slightly wrinkled, resting innocently atop a pile of coupons and utility bills, and I didn't open it immediately. I stared at it for hours, the way one stares at a sealed letter from a past self, knowing whatever it holds will shift the weight of the present. And when I finally tore it open, the room felt colder. Though nothing had changed, the curtains still breathed in rhythm with the wind. The teacup beside me still steamed. But something in me braced, as if the blood beneath my skin already recognized what my eyes were about to see. The report began with the surface: ancestry breakdown, ethnic percentages, migration patterns, maps and numbers that felt distant, almost irrelevant. But then, my gaze fell on a small tab: relative matches. My heart stuttered. I clicked, and in the span of a single breath, the world I knew unraveled with clinical precision. First line, full sibling match, Bronwyn H. Next, maternal match, Genevieve H. And the names didn't blink. The screen didn't flicker. But I did. The chair creaked beneath me as I leaned closer, as if proximity would dilute the truth. And there were percentages beside the names. Precise, irrefutable, strands of DNA spelling out a story that no one had written down. And I looked at my hands, remembering how Genevieve had once said, "You have your father's fingers." And I had dismissed it, laughed even. But now, those words echoed with new gravity, not just a guess, but a memory. Further down the page was a case ID, a code linked to a public record, and my hands moved before I could stop them. A few clicks later, it appeared. A baby girl, found wrapped in a hospital blanket outside a clinic 17 years ago. No name, no note. Just a time, a place, a date. Mine. And though the document said unclaimed, something in my chest whispered otherwise. I had been claimed, then left. My eyes stayed on that line longer than they should have, as if the screen might flicker into a different truth if I stared long enough, but it didn't. It stayed. The phone slipped from my hand, not because I was careless, but because I couldn't hold both the device and the weight of that moment. And it hit the floor with a dull sound, soft and final, like a truth landing, and I sank into the silence, not crying, not screaming, just sitting, letting the stillness settle around me like ash, because everything I had believed, the framed photos, the bedtime stories, the gentle assurances that I was where I belonged, now stood beside another truth that wouldn't move aside. I remember the way light fell across the living room carpet, catching on the edges of dust like glitter in a snow globe. And I remember thinking, how strange, for a world to look so unchanged when everything inside you is different. I remembered every time my mother said, "You were meant for us." And I believed her. I still do. But now I knew there was another beginning, one written in cells and statistics, in hospital records and names I hadn't grown up hearing, because DNA doesn't lie. And neither did the quiet ache in my ribs that had been there long before the envelope arrived. It had always been there, a silence that wasn't absence, but a placeholder. I didn't tell anyone that night. I simply sat in the dark. The screen dimmed beside me, the data still glowing faintly, as if even pixels carried memory, and as I traced the edges of that moment with my breath, I realized the truth had spoken, not in anger, not in accusation, but in a language older than words. I am their daughter, both of them, but only one side chose to stay. And now, I knew what it meant to be born twice, once in blood, once in love, and to be abandoned in both, in different ways. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, a quiet, suffocating kind of stillness. Genevieve had lit a candle, as if scent could soften truth, as if wax and flame might make memory more bearable. Bronwyn sat slouched on the armrest, arms folded like armor, eyes darting between me and the floor, and I stood across from them with the envelope in my hand. The printout folded once, precisely, as if neatness could disguise the weight it carried. I didn't say much, because I didn't need to. I placed the paper on the coffee table, white against the mahogany, and watched Genevieve's face drain of color before a word was spoken. She didn't reach for it, didn't blink, only trembled slightly, fingertips brushing the edge as if afraid that touching the truth would make it irreversible. "You know," she whispered, and the words came out not like a question, but a collapse. I nodded, once, and in that moment, I wasn't 17, wasn't composed. I was just a child trying to understand how a mother becomes a stranger, how a name printed on a document could undo years of silence and longing in one breath. "I was 19, Genevieve began, her voice thin, breaking like old glass. "I had nothing, no job, no support, no plan. Your father, he left before your first kick. My mind wasn't right, and the world wasn't kind, I thought." She stopped, eyes rimmed red. "I thought someone else could love you better than I could." The words hung between us, fragile and shivering. "I thought letting go would be mercy, not abandonment." Bronwyn shifted beside her. Her face, usually unreadable, now twisted into something harder to name, not anger, but betrayal folded in disbelief. "You told me she died," she said, voice low and strained. "You let me grow up thinking she never made it out of that hospital." Her words weren't sharp, they were tired. The kind of tired that comes from holding on to lies long enough they start to shape your spine. Genevieve turned to her, but Bronwyn looked away. And in that gap, I saw the fracture that had always existed, not between mother and daughter, but between what was kept and what was sacrificed. "I wanted to tell you both," Genevieve said, "but I didn't know how to say it without losing everything all over again." Her voice trembled. "I've lived every day with that silence eating me." I stood still. My chest didn't rise. My eyes didn't blink. And I had prepared for anger, for accusation, for fire. But what came was colder. I looked at her and saw not a villain, not a victim, but a woman suspended in her own regret. "You left me," I said, voice even. "You didn't lose me, you gave me away." And that truth, spoken aloud, filled the room like a storm cloud, heavy, slow, impossible to breathe beneath. Genevieve crumbled, not dramatically, not loudly, just folded in on herself, shoulders collapsing inward like a house with rotting beams. "I'm sorry," she said again and again, each repetition softer, like the words were running out of meaning the longer they were spoken. Bronwyn stood to leave, but paused at the door, eyes flicking back to me. There was something in her gaze I hadn't seen before. Not jealousy, not defiance, but a quiet plea. "Don't turn this into war." I didn't follow her, didn't cry. I sat in the chair Genevieve had offered and stared at the candle burning down to its wick. I thought of all the things I could say, all the questions I could ask, but none of them would undo what was already done. Because the truth is, even if you find the ones who made you, it doesn't mean they know how to hold you. And even if they cry, confess, repent, there are wounds so old, they bleed silence. And mine, tonight, was open again. I waited until evening. The sky outside was the color of ash and old secrets, and inside our house, the quiet had settled like dust on forgotten furniture. My parents were in the living room, sitting close but not touching, each pretending to read. I stood in the doorway, holding the truth not in my hands, but in my posture. In the silence I carried into the room with me, when I told them about Genevieve, Bronwyn, the test, the records. They didn't interrupt. My mother's eyes welled but didn't spill, and my father looked straight ahead, His jaw clenched so tightly I could hear the echo of all the things he wasn't saying. And when I finished, they still didn't speak. Not right away. Not because they didn't want to, but because some truths are too sharp to touch without gloves. Finally, my mother stood, crossed the room, and pulled me into her arms with a force that said, "We love you, even now, but love can't shield everything." Within days, Genevieve showed up again, this time with a lawyer. Not loud, not aggressive, but formal in a way that made everything feel less like family and more like a custody battle conducted in whispers. She wanted visitation. She said she had rights. My parents said they had papers. Adoption finalized, sealed, and I stood in the middle, a bridge no one wanted to burn, but both were slowly setting fire to. People noticed. At school, whispers bloomed like mold, and friends I'd known since childhood now looked at me with hesitation. As if my story had become something contagious, someone printed out the news article about the abandoned child, the DNA results, the legal petition, and taped it to my locker. And I took it down. But the tape left a residue that wouldn't fade. Like truth had a taste. And everyone wanted a lick of it. Lawyers spoke in long emails. Letters arrived in thick envelopes. My name appeared too many times on too many pages, and though no one asked me what I wanted, everyone claimed to speak for me, at home. My parents tried to remain calm, but I saw it in their movements, the stiffness, the overly cheerful tones, the long silences after the phone rang. They were trying to keep me safe. But safety now felt like a fence I hadn't asked for, built with fear, not trust. I started eating lunch in the music room, not because I was hiding, but because the piano didn't ask questions, and the echo in that room was mine alone to fill. Bronwyn passed me once in the hallway. We didn't speak, but she paused, briefly, and for a second. I wondered if she felt it too. This strange limbo between blood and choice. That night, I sat on the porch, knees to my chest, watching the sky bruise with dusk. My father stepped out, handed me a blanket, didn't sit. "Whatever happens," he said, "we chose you. That will never change." And I wanted to believe him. I needed to. But my world was no longer solid. It was a shattered mirror reflecting two homes, two names, two truths. The perfect painting had cracked. The colors bled. The lines blurred. And I, once so sure of the frame I lived in, now stood between canvases, not knowing which side held the real me. Two worlds had collided, and I, the child caught in the fault line, was being pulled in both directions, not by force, but by the weight of love, memory, and the echoes of choices I didn't make. Time slowed after the storm. Days bled into one another like ink through water, and I moved through them with the quiet stillness of someone trying not to wake a sleeping grief. I no longer checked the mailbox with anticipation, nor looked over my shoulder at school hallways. I simply existed, not lost, but not quite found either. Suspended in that in-between space where answers no longer echo but healing hasn't yet begun. Most evenings, I found myself alone with a notebook, writing things I never said out loud. Not secrets, not revelations, just thoughts, scattered like fallen leaves, heavy with the weight of sorting through love and abandonment, through choice and claim. My parents gave me space, but I could feel their watching, quiet, aching, constant. My mother would knock once before entering, then leave a cup of tea beside my desk. And my father, always up late now, would pause at my doorway, eyes searching for signs I couldn't give. I remembered Genevieve's hands, not when they trembled, but when they reached, for me, for Bronwyn, for a past she couldn't rewrite. There was sorrow in her, yes, but also something fractured, a tenderness never taught how to land. And Bronwyn, the girl with steel in her spine and smoke in her voice, passed me a note in the library one afternoon. There was no name, no explanation, only the careful fold of paper and the weight of something unsaid. Only the words, "I was cruel because I didn't know how to ask if you'd still want me." I read it twice, then folded it slowly, as if gentleness could rewrite intent. I didn't answer right away. Some wounds don't close just because the blade's been named. But the next day, I sat beside her in the cafeteria. We didn't speak, but we didn't need to, because sometimes forgiveness begins with proximity, with saying, through presence alone, "I see your pain too." In that stillness, I returned to the roots that raised me, not by blood, but by memory. Sunday pancakes, midnight fevers soothed by lullabies off-key, the quiet way my father repaired things I didn't know were broken. I saw, with new eyes, that love chosen over love obligated bears a softness that no DNA can replicate. They didn't have to keep me, but they did. Again and again, without condition, without regret. One evening, I took out the photo album my mother kept at the top of her closet, the one with my baby pictures. Birthday candles, scraped knees, snowmen with crooked scarves. And as I turned each page, something inside me anchored, not to the past I came from, but to the story that held me when I had no origin. This was home, not because it was perfect, but because it never asked me to earn it. When Genevieve called the next morning, I didn't answer. Instead, I wrote her a letter. I told her I forgave her, not to let her in, but to let myself breathe. I told her she would always be part of my beginning, but not my now. I told her I wished her healing, and I meant it. Then I folded the paper, sealed it, and placed it in the drawer beneath my journal. Because not everything needs to be sent. Some truths are just for the heart to hear. I chose, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, I chose the life that chose me back. The parents who didn't birth me, but built me, and in that choice, I found not closure, but peace, the kind that doesn't shout, but hums softly beneath your skin, reminding you that, sometimes, family isn't blood, it's the hands that held you when no one else reached. We met again, not in confrontation, but in the quiet lull of a late afternoon, when the world seemed too tired to hold grudges. Genevieve had brought tea, though none of us drank it. And Bronwyn sat with her hands in her lap, fingers twitching, as though unsure if they belonged to her or to the apology she couldn't yet form. I had chosen peace, but peace does not erase the path that led to it. It only softens the sharpest stones. We didn't speak in declarations, and there were no accusations, no dramatic apologies, just words traded gently like heirlooms being returned after years of absence. Instead, we talked like people learning to pronounce each other's names again, slowly, with pauses. I told them I forgave them, not because the pain had vanished, but because I was tired of carrying it like a second spine. I said I wasn't coming back, not in the way they had hoped, not to relive a past they never gave me, but I would not sever the thread. Because blood isn't everything, but it is something. Genevieve cried then, the kind of cry that doesn't ask for comfort, only acknowledgement. And Bronwyn, for once, didn't look away. She reached into her bag and handed me a photo, creased and fading, 2 little girls, one with curls, one with stubborn eyes, sitting on a swing. "She kept this," she said, her voice almost steady, "even when she said you were gone." That gesture, small as it was, felt like a door cracking open in a house I never thought I'd enter again. When I returned home, my parents didn't ask questions, they only held me. We sat together in the living room, with no television, no distractions, just presence that spoke more clearly than words. And in that stillness, I realized that the bond between us had stretched, not snapped, and that trust rebuilt is stronger than trust never tested. My mother kissed my forehead, and my father brushed my hair behind my ear. These were the languages I knew. Over the weeks, Bronwyn changed, subtly, quietly, deliberately. She volunteered at the library and applied for a scholarship. Sometimes, she texted me a joke, sometimes a quote, and once, she sent me a song, without explanation, just the title, Brave Enough. I listened, not because I owed her, but because curiosity is the cousin of healing, and though I didn't reply, I saved it. One weekend, she asked if I wanted to come to one of her art shows, a community center gallery, simple and warm, and I went. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see what her hands could make when they weren't clenched. I used to think family was a picture, posed, framed, dusted, something you hang and never touch, but now I know it's threads, messy, tangled, sometimes frayed, but stitched with choice, and pain, and the willingness to keep holding even when it slips. My story didn't return to where it started. It unfolded into something new, not cleaner, not simpler, but truer, and, in its unfolding, I realized that even broken lines can be traced into meaning, that history doesn't need to be rewritten to be re-understood. And in that truth, I stood between two women who bore my blood, and two souls who built my heart, not choosing one over the other, but choosing balance, choosing the breath between extremes. The perfect painting was gone, but from those fragments, I began crafting something sturdier, a tapestry of forgiveness and fact. Flawed, yes, but mine, because in the end, love that endures doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to be seen, held up to the light, and chosen. Again and again. The seasons shifted without ceremony. Spring crept in through the windows, filling corners with light and streets with laughter too distant to touch, but close enough to hear. I found myself waking earlier, moving slower, breathing deeper, as if the world had learned to exhale again, and I was relearning the shape of mornings not laced with worry. The acceptance letter came on a Thursday. I opened it alone, in the kitchen, with toast burning in the toaster and my mother humming in the garden. I didn't scream or cry. I just stood still, letting the words wash over me like rain after drought. I had made it, not just into a university, but into a future I had carved from memory and persistence, and in that moment, I didn't think of DNA, or bloodlines, or the name that came before mine. I thought of sacrifice, and laughter, and how love built on choice is stronger than any inheritance. We packed slowly, not because we were sad, but because every object held a story, the cracked bowl I broke when I was 6. The photo of us with matching raincoats. The corner of the wall where my height had been measured in pencil and pride. As boxes filled, the house grew quieter, not emptier, as though it understood we weren't leaving it behind, but carrying it forward. My father labeled each box meticulously, and my mother wrapped every dish with care, while I folded a family into cardboard, not out of loss, but of gratitude. The new house wasn't bigger, just different. More windows, more trees, less history clinging to its corners. The first night, we ate pizza on the floor, laughed about how the fridge made a sound like it was sighing, and hung the first photo, a new one, Us. Arms tangled, eyes tired, but smiling. It wasn't a replacement for anything lost. It was a stake in new ground. Proof that what's rebuilt can still be beautiful. The past didn't follow us, but the love did. It was Bronwyn who reached out first, her name appearing on my screen like a ripple across still water. Unexpected but not unwelcome. We talked briefly about classes, books, her dog's new obsession with socks, and there was no apology, no accounting, just presence. And it was enough. She was changing. I was moving on, and we were not mended. But we were no longer at war. One evening, I walked alone through the new neighborhood, past fences and porches and the scent of barbecues. I stopped at a small hill, climbed it, and sat beneath the sunset. In my hands was a photograph, not old, not creased, not inherited, but new. Ours. My parents beside me, their smiles soft, their hands steady. This, I thought, is the family I chose? Or maybe, the one that chose me, again and again, without condition. And in the hush of twilight, as gold slipped into blue, I whispered it to no one and to everyone. Blood may not lie, but the heart can. And mine, finally, had spoken. Not in anger, not in ache, but in clarity. Because family isn't always about who you came from. Sometimes, it's about who stays, who shows up, who sees you. Not as a mistake, not as a question, but as a whole story worth holding. The photo fluttered in my hand as the wind moved gently, like memory turning a page. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I no longer needed it to be. I had found something better. I had found home, not where I began, but where I chose to stay.